Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Justin Mogilski. He's assistant professor at the current research examines conflict resolution within consensually non-monogamous romantic relationships like polyamory, open relationships, and swing. How evolution has shaped moral decision making and individual differences in predatory intimate relationship behaviors. And we're going to focus today mostly on relationship satisfaction within monogamous and non-monogamous romantic relationships. So, Dr. Mogilski, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, what is really relationship satisfaction? How would you define it?
Yeah, so I think that there are several ways to approach that question. Given my background, so I'm trained as an evolutionary psychologist, and so how I think about relationships is that you have these two autonomous individuals coming together to collaborate in accomplishing some type of goal, and that goal could be sexual satisfaction. It could be support for one another in pursuit of long-term goals such as marriage, raising children, etc. Relationship satisfaction that I think is pretty consistent across the many literatures that define it in different ways is two individuals are getting together to collaborate towards those goals, and in the process they are either getting what they need from that collaboration or they are not. And so I think that much of relationship satisfaction comes down to how effectively two people or more can collaborate to accomplish what they want from the relationship.
And what predicts it? I mean, is it possible in any way knowing, for example, each person's psychological traits, personality, and whatever else, their values, how compatible, whatever compatible means, they are? Is it possible to predict if they will have a satisfactory relationship or not?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, so I think you hit it on the head. There are personality predictors. I think there are situational predictors. So, for example, I think one of the most robust findings I've seen is, you hear the stereotype that people who are dissimilar are attracted to each other, but more often than not, you see that similarity is a quite a good predictor. So, similarity in values, similarity in what those relationship goals are that you are pursuing. So, when two people, I think, have a similar expectation of what they want from the relationship and how to pursue it, and they are able to give each other what they're looking for, there tends to be greater satisfaction. In terms of personality, I mean, you can delve into the communication literature and how people in relationships communicate with one another. You can look at things like attachment, the degree to which attachments are matched or mismatched. So in my mind, a lot of it boils down to whether individuals are matched, or at least whether their relationship goals are compatible with one another. That, I would say, from my reading, that would be one of the strongest predictors.
And by values here, women, for example, moral values, political values, stuff like that. And by goals, for example, both wanting to have kids. If one of them wants and the other doesn't, then that usually is a deal breaker, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it could be children. It could even be in terms of, and I think one of the most interesting literatures I've been reading recently that is related, I think, when we start talking about consensual non-monogamy, is the degree to which people's sociologies are matched or
Right.
mismatched. So to the degree that you are relatively more unrestricted or have a greater interest in a desire for casual sex, if you and your partner both have a similar sociosexuality, whether that's unrestricted or restricted, relationship quality tends to be relatively higher. So yes.
By the way, sort of related to that, what about emotional and sexual accessibility? How important is each of those, and are there sex differences when it comes to their relative importance?
Yeah, and so this is one of the I would say more robust findings from the evolutionary psychological research research. So when you look at the goals that people have within relationships, it's easy to, I think, divide them into two primary categories, right? Goals that are related to satisfying sexual desires, interest in having sex, good sex, and everything related to having sex, versus emotional support, being there for one another, providing resources for each other, commitment, collaboration towards. And see this dichotomy between sexual accessibility or the sexual aspects of a relationship versus the emotional accessibility or the emotional aspects. And the robust finding that you see is that there does tend to be a sex difference in how relatively how important a partner's, specifically, mostly it studies infidelity, so how upset men and women become in response to their partner having sex with or falling in love with, emotionally investing in another person. And what you tend to see is that relative to women, men tend to be more upset by a partner's sexual infidelity versus women tend to be more upset by relatively more upset than men by a partner's emotional infidelity. And so one of the things that my advisor back in the day, so several years ago, we published this study on emotional versus sexual accessibility is, well, beyond having relationships with other people, are you even getting what you need from your partner? So when we say accessibility, that's what we're referring to is how often are you able to get the amount of sex or quality of sex that you're looking for from your partner, sexual accessibility, versus that support from your partner. And what we found, and we could talk about the design if you want, but one of the main findings from that is that we replicated that sex difference, whereby overall, men and women both wanted emotional accessibility. That was the most important thing for both men and women. But relative to one another, we replicated that sex difference where men cared a bit more about their partner's sexual accessibility and women cared a little bit more about emotional accessibility of their partner.
Mm-hmm. So I have a follow-up question, but just before that, tell us then about how the study was designed.
So we used back in my PhD, I was pioneering something called conjoint analysis. And one of the advantages of a conjoint design is that you design these profiles that vary by each of the characteristics that you might be interested in exploring. So for example, in this case, we wanted to know, given a situation where, say, your partner can be varying amounts of sexually accessible and varying amounts of emotionally accessible, if you were shown these profiles where a partner was, say, highly accessible sexually but very lowly accessible in terms of emotions, or vice versa, or maybe some medium amount of emotional accessibility and some high amount of sexual accessibility. Given these different combinations, you can ask people to rank each profile, rank each situation, or a different permutation of those traits. And then from those rankings, you perform what's called conjoint analysis, and that gives you the relative importance of each of the traits that make up that profile. So we were able to get the relative importance of sexual versus emotional accessibility. And importantly, they didn't rate each of these types of accessibility separately. They had to consider each of them relative to the other. So what it reveals is, given that you have to make these trade-offs between whether a partner is sexually or emotionally accessible, even when they have to make those trade-offs, men are prioritizing sexual accessibility and to prioritize emotional accessibility relative to the other sex.
Mm-hmm. But now, I mean, my follow-up, just before we move on to another topic, I think it's important here to mention that these differences are always averages, right? Because I mean, there are certainly, for example, men out there. I would imagine that a clear example of that would be men who have an anxious attachment style, who probably need much more emotional accessibility. And also in terms of the sexual accessibility, both for men and women, it would depend a lot on each one's sex drive, right?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's the right way to frame it. And I think that I think it's also important to understand that. So, sex is a category, and this is something that you see, and I think that EvPsych is criticized for quite a bit, as we focus so much on sex differences. But you're right that sex characteristics across which we can compare the relative importance of something. And so, compared, if you were to measure, attachment as well as communication style, if you look at sociosexuality, if you were to account for all these other personality variables, arguably the differences among all of those variables are going to matter more than just the differences between men and women. But it is always interesting to know differences on average between men and women for the purposes of describing arguably one of the characteristics that divides the population the most, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, to really be more rigorous, the best here is always to have, as far as possible, of course, multifactorial analysis. It's not one single factor, ever.
Correct. Right. Yep. Great point.
Yeah. So what are then consensual or consensually non-monogamous relationships? So
monogamy is you're mated to one and only one other individual. You have an exclusive relationship, and it's one just single pair bond. So non-monogamy is anything that involves more than more than two individuals at a given time. And non-monogamy manifests in a number of ways, but consensual non-monogamy is specifically the practice whereby partners are involved with more than one romantic partner at a time, and everyone knows about it. It's consensual. They understand it. There are at least in an ideal world, there are no secrets kept. There's no dishonesty about whether those relationships exist or not. So it includes practices like polyamory, swinging, open relationships. I would throw relationship anarchy in there as well. And more broadly, lately, what I've found useful is to define consensual non-monogamy really as one set of strategies that exist within a larger set of what I'd consider multi-partnering, whereby just generally you can be involved with more than one person. Consensual non-monogamy is specifically the practice whereby every partner knows what's going on, and there are specific relationship maintenance strategies associated with being in a consensually non-monogamous relationship.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get into that, but just about the consensual bit, I mean, is it, okay, so let's say that two people are partnered and they decide to have an open relationship or be polyamorous. I mean, they define for themselves that they're going to have romantic relationships with other people or just sleep with other people, something like that. I mean, for it to be consensual, is it always necessary for them to tell their partner every time they are with other people, they sleep with other people, or with whom they have other romantic relationships, or it's just a matter of them knowing that they are doing it with other people?
So broadly, it's defined by having a set of agreements or boundaries that regulate how those interactions occur. So not every person is going to say, oh, I went out with this person and here are all the details that you need to know about that particular date or that particular partner. But rather, either at the beginning of the relationship or if it's opening up later on, you establish these ground rules as to what those interactions might look like, what kinds of intimate interactions between, say, a partner and an extra pair or another individual would be, just so that everyone, because one of the arguments that I've made recently is I think that there are certain risks or potential costs to maintaining more than one relationship at a time. And so a lot of these boundaries, these negotiations are there to help to minimize those costs or to minimize the risk, establish a greater amount of certainty about what those interactions are going to be like and whether they're going to be costly to the other partner. And so they can consent to it insofar as they feel more comfortable that nothing that say that extra relationship isn't going to threaten the stability of their relationship, of their in-pair relationship, or it's not going to, say, lead to transmission of a sexually transmitted infection, something like that, or lead to an unwanted pregnancy. So it's much more about establishing kind of relationship-specific guidelines for what those other extra pair interactions are going to look like.
Mm-hmm. But apart from STIs and pregnancies, which I think are the most obvious potential costs, what are some of the other ones?
So one is, so I think, and so recently I published a study looking at the various types of costs that people perceive to be associated with non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy in particular. Mm-hmm. And really one of the factors, so we ended up doing a factor analysis where we got a bunch of ACT-nominated reasons for having a negative attitude towards CNM. We did factor analysis, so we were able to identify kind of clusters of potential relationship costs. And the one that floated to the top was actually anticipated relationship conflict. And that included things like you were afraid that you were going to lose time that you would normally spend with a partner, that they might disinvest from the relationship. So if you think about the degree to which you could have conflict with a partner on, say, emotional or sexual accessibility, if you are losing that accessibility, there could be conflict caused by that, and that could lead to, say, discoordination of the couple. If, say, you have children and you need to coordinate on taking care of those children, if one person is off spending more of their time, energy, resources elsewhere, that could be something that causes conflict. So I think what I would consider those are almost intersexual conflict, such that you have conflict between the two partners who are romantically involved. But the other end of it is, I think that you also expose yourself to potential rivalry, such that if you have, say, you have multiple partners, you have, say, your partner spending time with someone else, you could start to feel competitive with that other person. And certainly there are plenty of historical examples of say, two men, two women. Of course, it doesn't have to be gendered, but as a stereotypical example, say two men getting into conflict, and that conflict can not only look coercive or deceptive, it can potentially get violent. So I would argue that rivalry is another one of those costs that can crop up when you have more than two individuals concurrently involved.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps related to that, and also perhaps with some other things, I'm not sure if this is something that I'm thinking about because I read something in evolutionary psychology or relationship psychology, or if it's just an intuition. But for example, even if two people decide that they're going to be in a polyamorous relationship or an open relationship, for example, couldn't it be sometimes the case that they might experience jealousy, or they might get in conflict with their partner because their partner gets involved with specific people that might pose a risk to them in some sort of way?
Yes, absolutely. And that is how we think about jealousy. So jealousy is, to define it, an emotion that is elicited. You feel it when you perceive that there is a threat to a valued relationship. Mm-hmm. So I think in any situation where you're involved with someone else, you highly value your relationship with them, you to some degree would have anxiety about losing them or losing their investment or losing whatever you're getting from that relationship, then yeah, you're going to experience more jealousy. And within consensually non-monogamous relationships, I've gathered data looking at rates of jealousy within these relationships, and what we observe is, first of all, everyone's experiencing jealousy. I think there's a myth that people in polyamorous, swinging relationships, etc., that they just don't feel jealous, and that's what makes it possible for them. But people do feel jealous, and especially what we found is we compared the rates of jealousy with primary versus secondary partners, which is a rough way of categorizing partners whom they see they could have a shared lifelong commitment to, they have shared goals, they potentially might get married, versus a secondary partner might be someone that you're involved with who you don't share those same kinds of goals with. And so with someone as a primary partner, people report relatively more jealousy. And of course, that makes sense given that it is a protective emotion. What we did find, though, in one of our studies is that people who are consensually non-monogamous tended to report lower levels of what's called emotional jealousy. So we used a measure, it's called the multidimensional jealousy scale, that measures emotional jealousy, which is kind of that hot, fiery, affective jealousy, that reaction that you have to, say, finding out that your partner might be involved with someone else. There's also cognitive jealousy, which is how much you ruminate or think about jealousy. And then also behavioral jealousy, which is like mate retention, the kinds of things you do to prevent your partner from interacting with others. And what we found is that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships tended to report fairly lower amounts of emotional jealousy. So although they are comparable and actually slightly higher cognitive jealousy. And so what we're seeing is that they're still experiencing jealousy, but they may be doing something to reduce the amount of that hot, fiery, reactive jealousy that they feel. And arguably, that's kind of one of the worst, possibly the most conflict-inducing types of jealousy, right? Is that when you're feeling kind of overwhelmed and you react to the situation. It seems that they're doing something to mitigate that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this just came to mind now, but could it have at least sometimes anything to do with comparing mate value? For example, if someone is in a polyamorous relationship and suddenly their primary partner, let's say, she knows that he's sleeping around with a woman who is higher in mate value, for example, because she is more beautiful or something like that. I mean, could that be a trigger for jealousy in that case?
I could absolutely see that. I will say that I do not know of any study that has published that particular finding. However, I did once, several years ago, collect some data. This has not been published, so take everything with a grain of salt. But what we found is we did record mate value using something called the trait-specific dependence inventory. And it looks
what's that about?
So it looks at different facets of mate value, including physical attractiveness, what's called surgency, or kind of how confident and kind of outgoing you tend to be. So thinking of it as something like extroversion. Also looking at industriousness, the degree to which you tend to be kind of active in having and maintaining a job and being kind of having social status, etc. So what we did was we administered this to individuals who are in consensually non-monogamous and monogamous relationships. And what we found is that people who were relatively higher mate value than their current partner, so that is, they tended to score higher overall on these traits that we were measuring than their partner, reported greater willingness to engage in consensual non-monogamy. So it seems that when our interpretation of this is when it is more propitious, when it's more beneficial potentially to be interested in non-monogamy, to form these other relationships, you might be more willing to do so. So as in terms of jealousy, experiencing jealousy in reaction to whether you are relatively higher or lower mate value than your partner, it hasn't been tested, but it absolutely, as far as I know, it absolutely makes sense that if you were relatively lower mate value than your partner, you might be more likely to feel jealous, because the chances of you finding someone who, or at least your perception that you will find someone who is just as valuable as they are, might be relatively more I don't want to say hopeless, but it might not seem as likely, right?
Right. So we've been, of course, mentioning some things where conflict might arise from in romantic relationships, and we've been talking mostly about non-monogamous relationships, but are there big differences when it comes to conflict arises from between monogamous and non-monogamous relationships?
So I would say that, and I think this is a very important point to digest, is that there are more similarities than there are differences. So from the literature, and I've kind of summarized this in several of my papers at this point, if you look at the reasons that people get into relationships and then the kinds of conflict that they tend to encounter, monogamous people and non-monogamous individuals tend to have the same desires for getting into a relationship and the same reasons for having conflict. So you are looking for a relationship partner, someone that you can spend time with, someone that you can have sex with, someone who you can, again, pursue shared goals together. You're looking for some kind of need fulfillment from that relationship. And then when it comes to conflict, time spent together, those accessibility deficits, conflict over, how money is spent, the really mundane stuff that I think everyone has heard of at this point. And so more similarities than differences. The big differences, I would argue, arise when you look at how level of complexity bond between just two people and maintaining a pair bond plus an additional pair bond or more. Because what you're doing is when you have just two individuals who are involved with one another, all you really need to do is make sure that you are coordinating your relationship effort with that other person. When you add in another person, now not only do you need to coordinate effort with them, but as an individual, you might have to share some amount of time, some amount of resources with another individual, and that could create conflict, an additional variable that you wouldn't expect in a monogamous relationship between, say, your partner and your other extra pair partner. So what you're doing is the kinds of conflict that you would expect in a monogamous relationship when someone is committing infidelity or they are, interacting with someone else outside of the agreement of their relationship, what you're doing is you are introducing that, but you're introducing it in a consensual and kind of controlled way. So people in consensually non-monogamous relationships tend to have less conflict than people who are committing infidelity, but they still have to manage the complexities of having more than one partner. So where conflict arises, it's usually because of that greater complexity.
So, just before I ask you the next question, it's certainly not the case that people can claim that monogamy or non-monogamy, that one of them is really better or superior, right? It depends on each person's personality traits, other psychological traits, attachment style, and all of that, right?
I think it's about fit. Yeah. So for some people, I think monogamy is a very good fit. To the degree that you want to have this kind of relationship that is exclusive, where that resources are really only being biased towards you rather than being biased towards, to the degree that comfort, to the degree that maybe it, so I know there are plenty of colleagues who I know who argue that there's, in terms of childcare, I think a lot of people assume that monogamy is ideal for childcare. And I think that there is at least some logic to that, where if say being non-monogamous divides your effort between multiple people, it might take away from childcare. But there are also many benefits to potentially being raised in a family where you have, say, multiple partners, multiple possible parental or social figures. There are those who argue that there are kind of unique benefits to childcare in that circumstance. And
so in that specific case, it might even connect to cooperative breeding, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly, right. And I think the animal literature does a pretty good job of kind of describing in what situations cooperative breeding kind of is more efficient, right? Or at least, again, it has its unique benefits.
Right.
So, sorry, what was the original question?
Well, I was asking if it makes sense at all to say that monogamy or
Yes,
non-monogamy is
yes.
superior.
Yes, yes. And so I think that for some people, non-monogamy is going to be relatively more fit as well. So again, my example of someone who has a relatively more unrestricted sociosexuality, if you have a fairly strong drive for intimate partner variety, that is having relationships with multiple people, kind of forming, um, getting some certain needs fulfilled through that variety, non-monogamy could be better fit for those individuals. And that can change across time. So there aren't just these kind of personality variables there are some personality variables that predict interest in monogamy or consensual non-monogamy, but those variables can shift across time where, say, as you get older and maybe you have more free time or you have kind of, you're more kind of solidly established in your life and your career, and you have the opportunity to kind of form other relationships, people's interests can shift across time as well. So yes, I think that saying that one is superior to the other is doing injustice to how I think, and you see this across many species, there are niches to be filled, right? Mm-hmm. There are certain environmental niches where you're better fit to a certain niche at certain times in your life under certain circumstances. So it's all about whether your relationship structure serves whatever your current relationship goals are.
Right. So we've talked about jealousy and where it usually stems from. I think that one specific aspect about it we haven't touched on too much is how do people deal with jealousy in monogamous versus non-monogamous relationships?
Yeah. So I think the traditional paradigm is when you feel jealous, and there's a distinction between typically what's called reactive jealousy versus suspicious jealousy. So the argument is that traditionally reactive jealousy, whereas you actually observe your partner interacting with someone else, you get jealous because it's right there in front of you. What you're doing is you might be addressing, say, one of those accessibility deficits. So expressing that jealousy, working through it, can be helpful in that sense. Versus suspicious jealousy is you're just chronically thinking jealous thoughts and it's not in response to anything. That tends to be associated with relatively lower relationship quality. So in terms of dealing with jealousy, I think at least within monogamous relationships, the idea is you are exclusively mated to one another. That is the expectation. So if your partner is off doing something with someone else, you need to bring that up. You need to address relationship deficits. You need to somehow kind of hopefully entice them back into the relationship or make it known that it's unacceptable that they have this other relationship. And there are quite a few other kind of jealousy processing strategies that you can kind of engage in. In terms of non-monogamy, though, the idea is you're not trying to necessarily express jealousy so that your partner stops interacting with this other person. You accept that that's going to happen. In fact, you might recognize that that is something that is good for them. And within consensually non-monogamous, that's often what you hear people report for how they overcome jealousy is this feeling where my relationship is threatened, I need to stop them from interacting with someone. The alternative to that is you might recognize that your partner is having a good time, that they are achieving some kind of fulfillment by interacting with another person. And so a lot of people in consensually non-monogamous relationships reports a kind of a separate emotion that's called compersion. And that's the feeling of experiencing joy or being happy that your partner is involved with another person. Again, I think related. There's a lot that we don't know about compersion. The research on it has really blossomed within maybe the past 5, 6, 7 years. But the idea is you would feel compersion as a way of appreciating that your partner's interactions with others may not threaten your in-pair relationship, and in fact could potentially make it stronger. Whereby if your partner feels fulfilled, they are happy, then they have less reason to be dissatisfied in their relationship with you. Mm-hmm. So in terms of dealing with jealousy, I very often within the literature see a technique called cognitive reframing, which is the idea that when you would normally experience jealousy as this negative feeling, you could instead experience it as, or rethink of it as, or rethink of your partner's interactions with other people as a positive thing. To the extent that you would want to see your partner happy in any circumstance, this would be another situation where they could find happiness from their interactions with other people, and that could make your relationship better. The other thing is, if jealousy is in response to a perceived threat, what you do is you reduce that perceived threat. So that is, if, I'll give you a good example of this, if your partner is involved with someone else, what you might do, especially if you don't know who they are, you've never interacted with them, you're not friends with them, you know nothing about them, what you're probably going to do is simulate who they are, what their intentions are towards your partner, what intentions they have towards you, or how competitive they might be towards you. Person actually make you kind of, it can amplify that jealousy, it can make it much worse. Whereas if you were to know them, maybe to be friendly with them, to understand them and understand what they're getting out of the relationship with your partner, then you can have a bit more compassion for them. Or you can realize, for example, that the relationship your partner has with this other person, it's not going to lead to your partner leaving you. It's not going to lead to them investing heavy resources elsewhere. And so if you know that that extra pair relationship is not a threat, it can be easier to down-regulate jealousy because there's no problem to be addressed. So that's what you very often see in consensually non-monogamous relationships, is people communicate to a degree where they may feel far less threatened by their partner's interactions with others.
Mm-hmm. Do people approach conflict resolution in different ways in different kinds of relationships?
So going back to the relationship maintenance strategies that, so to kind of bring everyone up to date on what my current project is, I'm running an international project where we are looking at the kinds of relationship maintenance strategies that people in non-monogamous relationships use to reduce the conflict that we would expect given the greater complexity, at least I would argue, of consensual relationships where you have more than just kind of two individuals. So in terms of conflict resolution within a pair bond, within a monogamous relationship, you might expect to see, again, some of the more traditional techniques of you're communicating about, access deficits, you are communicating about whether your partner is doing as you would have originally agreed within that relationship. With consensually non-monogamous relationships, because you have now, there's this explicit potential conflict between your partner and your other partner, and you investing resources in perhaps more than one partner, what you have to do is consider things like how resources are distributed among partners. So I can start going through some of the strategies that we identified. One is resource distribution. So how carefully you think about, say, the time, attention, monetary resources that you invest in each of your partners, and is that done in a way that is fair to both and meets the expectations of each partner. So kind of explicitly negotiating how much and you see this one of the most popular kind of techniques for doing that is for partners within, say, a polyamorous relationship to share Google calendars, so that everyone knows, okay, I'm going to be spending time with this person at this time, and then the next day is going to be this other person's day, and so you're very explicit about who's spending time with whom and in what quantity, and you try to make that equitable. One of the other techniques that we identified is again, when we look at the potential for STIs to spread. If you have sex with more than one individual and that is unregulated, that is, you are not considering whether that partner, whether that other person has been tested, whether you're not taking precaution, there is a higher chance of STI spreading. And so what you see very common, especially polyamorous people tend to seem to be the best at this. But polyamorous people, people in swinging relationships, they tend to very regularly get tested, and they have very high thresholds for whether they are willing to have sex with or be physically intimate with someone when there is a risk of STIs being transmitted. So in terms of conflict resolution for broadly, people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, I think, are specifically engaging in resolution strategies that address the unique challenges of being in more than one relationship at once. So again, more similarities than differences between monogamous and consensually non-monogamous people. Everyone is going through the kind of the traditional relationship issues, but on top of that, if you are involved with more than one person, you got to consider how are resources distributed. Is there the potential for sexually transmitted infection? Is there some other techniques? Whether you consider some partners kind of higher on a hierarchy than others. So do you prioritize some partners versus others? And is that clear? Is that explicit within the relationship? So doing things that help to address those unique issues.
Mm-hmm. And are there sex differences in reconciliation behavior after romantic conflict?
So there are, I'm not going to summarize the entire gamut of conciliatory behaviors, but I think, so again, one of my colleagues and I my advisor back several years ago, we published a study looking at kind of sex differences in reconciliation behavior, and we actually saw something that again matches the difference in how men versus women tend to think of emotional versus sexual infidelity. And so after a conflict, the degree to which men were willing to express emotional investment, to kind of express the things that you would stereotypically, or at least on average, expect women to prefer or prioritize, if men showed that to them, that was perceived as a more effective conciliatory tactic versus for men, because men on average prioritize relative to women their partner's kind of sexual fidelities, sexual behavior, having sex or the like was seen as a more effective reconciliation tactic. Again, more similarities than differences, and that's one of the things that whenever I talk about sex differences, that's the big note is we're all human. We all have many of the same problems, but where you see those differences is specifically going to be in relation to the unique adaptive challenges that men and women have had to overcome throughout most of human history.
Mm-hmm. Does having a preference for multi-partner mating have anything to do with life history?
So yeah, I published a paper several years ago looking at this question. So to very briefly define, life history theory has been very popular in the evolutionary sciences for some time, and it's come under fire recently. I think there have been some very important and noteworthy criticisms of the theory, but the idea in general is that people throughout their lifespan will make trade-offs between what's known as a reproductive effort versus somatic effort. And reproductive effort is effort made towards mating, having children, reproduction. And somatic effort is anything that is meant to invest resources such that in the future you will have a kind of more stable, you're investing resources into yourself so that the future tends to be more stable and predictable. So the idea is we hypothesize that to the extent that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are, and this is a finding that has been replicated again and again, tend to have more unrestricted sociosexuality, more positive attitudes towards casual sex. We actually anticipated that they might engage in what's known as a faster life history. That is, they tend to engage in reproductive effort earlier on in their life, and there are a number of kind of psychological traits that tend to define a faster life history. And what we found is that, yes, people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, more so than those in monogamous relationships, were more likely to report lower disgust sensitivity. So that is, to the degree that your reproductive effort requires you not being inhibited by disgust. If you were to have a lower disgust sensitivity, there would be less of a barrier to entry to having sexual relationships with multiple people. They tended to score relatively higher on risk taking, specifically health and ethical risk taking, and they were one of the other things that you tend to see with life history, or at least a finding that's well replicated in Western societies, not so much in non-Western or traditional or non-industrialized societies, is that women tend to, who have a faster life history, they tend to go through they tend to go through puberty earlier. And so we found that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, women specifically in CNM relationships, were less likely to, or so they were more likely to report that they went through puberty earlier in life. So it seems that there might be people who are in non-monogamous relationships in general may be more likely to be on that faster end of the life history continuum. And one of the arguments that I make is, to the degree that that is going to predict multi-partnering, that is having multiple partners, these individuals might be those who, if they were in monogamous relationships, they might be more prone to cheat on their partner, to engage in behaviors that destabilize relationships. But what they're doing is they're kind of fulfilling that kind of I suppose managing that developmental trajectory by engaging in multi-partnering, but doing it in a way that involves their partner, that seeks consent, that is arguably perhaps a little more ethical than, say, being in a monogamous relationship and committing infidelity. And that's one of the hypotheses that we are testing in the international project: is, are these individuals engaging in behaviors that would reduce some of the costs that you might see from pursuing a fast life history track.
Right. So one last topic I would like to ask you about. Consensual non-monogamy is so morally condemned. I bet there should be some evolutionary rationale behind that, right?
Yeah. So I think there are many reasons. And in fact, I've talked to my other colleagues in kind of the consensual non-monogamy literature about this, and I tend to be the evolutionary perspective in all this, and they tend to have, I would say, more kind of socially informed, culture informed explanations for this. Yeah. What I would argue is that stigma that is moralizing a certain behavior does serve a purpose. That is, if you were to stigmatize any kind of behavior, then what you're doing is you are communicating to other people that you think that this is harmful, that this is something that they should not engage in. And in fact, if you look at, of the things that we tend to stigmatize, unrestricted sexual behavior tends to be highly stigmatized by a large portion of the population. And so I think that there is this overlap between people are stigmatizing unrestricted sociosexual behavior because it could lead to greater amounts of conflict, both between partners and between potential rivals. It might lead to relatively greater amounts of sexually transmitted infection. And so to stigmatize those kinds of behaviors may have historically served the purpose of reducing those costs to individuals and the communities into which they're nested. But I would argue that unrestricted sociosexual behavior would be a bit different than being in just a consensually non-monogamous relationship, because now, yes, you might be relatively more unrestricted, but you're doing so in a way that is taking precaution. So that is, you're engaging in the kinds of non-monogamous behaviors that people would seek to decrease through stigmatization, but instead they're being decreased or regulated through, again, these relationship maintenance practices that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships report. So they're kind of, I would argue they're kind of getting ahead of the game a little bit. They're getting ahead of the problems and anticipating them. So I would argue that that stigma against consensually non-monogamous relationships is somewhat, I think it's a bit wrong-headed just because it's being conflated with unrestricted sociosexual behavior that is not well regulated by these maintenance practices, if that makes sense.
Yes. So would you like to tell us about your current and potential future projects?
Yeah, so this international project it's got a lot of data, and so over the next several years we're going to be publishing it. This is data collected. I think what we're up to right now is something like 60% is from the United States, 20% is from Europe, and then we have another 20% scattered about the globe. So what I anticipate happening is, so we've already analyzed some of the data. Our goal has been through this project to not only identify the various behaviors that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships are engaging in, but create a measure so that we can administer it to someone and say, how closely do you adhere to these relationship maintenance practices? And the idea is, if you adhere relatively more closely, you should have greater relationship satisfaction, less conflict, and we also measured kind of health, relationship health, personal health. And so we've created this measure. We've actually run those regressions, and we do find support for our hypotheses, such that people who engage in several of the behaviors that we identify do tend to report more satisfaction and less conflict. So what I expect going forward is, now that we've established this measure and shown that people who engage in these behaviors are more likely to experience positive relationship outcomes, we need to show a causal link between the two. And so we are currently designing and attempting to implement kind of an experimental design where we manipulate or have some kind of educational or therapeutic intervention where we find people who are in non-monogamous relationships. We instruct them on these strategies, familiarize them with these strategies, and then observe whether their adherence to those strategies tends to improve their relationship over time. And I think that this is an important direction to take. I think this work is very important because the world is full of, I think, people who have an interest in having multiple partners, and the traditional solution to that has pretty much either just let it go and there are no rules to love, just let it happen and we'll see what goes on, or enforce monogamy and ask people to just be with one another and to ignore those other relationships that they could have. I would argue, though, that if we could identify these strategies and know that they improve people's relationship outcomes in these multi-partner relationships, then we're going to have a tool, we're going to have a new set of scripts that we can give to people for how to successfully have non-monogamous relationships, but in a way that is still safe, in a way that is still, I think, again, taking precaution against some of those costs to being, potential risks to being in more than one relationship. So a lot of future, this is where I see my life taking me over the next several years. Is we analyze this data, we run the experiments, we develop this model, and well, I guess we'll see if it works.
Great. So, and if people want to know more about your work and to follow it, where can they find you on the internet?
So if you actually want to read my work, I would go to ResearchGate. That's where I put all my stats, where I record my stats the most. So it's helpful for people to actually to go there, but you can find it on Google Scholar as well. I am on Twitter. I'm not super active on social media, but you follow me, and I sometimes post things that are worth reading.
Dr. Mogilski, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I hope to have you on again in the future to talk about the results of what you're working on at the moment.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was great. I appreciate it.
Okay, so